One of the things that I noticed about your title is of research. So I was curious if that was part of the research that you're doing with Riot right now.
Yeah, so last year we released a research report with Blockware, Joe Burnett there, where we looked at transaction fees for Bitcoin and what their purpose is, how they get paid, and the historical trends around them. Because there's a lot of, again, narratives around transaction fees, and we wanted to demystify them. So that was our research report last year. Lately, I've been looking at really the utilization rate of Bitcoin block space and the market around block space. So gets into the conversation of ordinals and inscriptions.
Yes.
But that's kind of the research piece of my role.
I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the many reasons I wanted to talk to you today. Someone was saying you're probably one of the only people in the whole Bitcoin space that can really understand the whole ordinal debate. But on Twitter right now, it's a fire as people are debating this whole new thing of being able to put NFTs on the Bitcoin blockchain. And one of the things I so respect about you, Pierre, is you have such a capacity to break things down in a simple manner and articulate both sides of the discussion. So I'd love to hear your take on the great ordinal debate, starting with helping our listeners understand what is going on here, what is this all about, and what are the implications for the Bitcoin network?
Yeah, so I think that we'd have to start with describing what ordinals are. So the ordinal numbering system that Casey Rodarmer came up with, and he's the inventor of this, a way of essentially taking the Bitcoin ledger and layering on top of it a map where we are essentially mapping serial numbers or unique identifiers to each Satoshi. Now, the reason we have to do this is because on the actual Bitcoin ledger, there is no such mapping. There's Satoshis are actually fungible, and there's lots of debate about what that word means, fungibility. But basically, the idea being that when you are unlocking Satoshis with a Bitcoin transaction and then locking them back up, there's no identity that is carried forth from the unlocking to the locking back up. They get put into a common pool,
Right.
and there's no way of having serial numbers at the base layer.
Mm-hmm.
So Casey's created a layer on top of Bitcoin that references the Bitcoin ledger, but is not necessarily enforced by the Bitcoin ledger. So the metaphor I use, and I use it without prejudice, because when people hear this metaphor, they think I'm casting aspersions on ordinals, but I'm really not, is that you could think of the Bitcoin ledger as astronomy and looking at the data there, and that ordinals are like astrology, where we're mapping on meaning on top of something that's objective, right? And
there's 21 million Satoshis, but on top of that, there's new layers of meaning that are being added on to each of those sats. Is that correct?
yes.
Okay.
So there's 2.1 quadrillion Satoshis.
Right, total Satoshis.
Yeah, 21 million Bitcoin. One Bitcoin is divisible into 100 million
100 million
Satoshis.
Satoshis. That's right.
Yeah, the units are we're still wrapping our heads around all the different units in Bitcoin, but now we've got more to learn about with ordinals. So that is basically what ordinals are, and I think that it's fairly innocuous and kind of just a harmless hobby that Casey has discovered. What I want to highlight is that in terms of the methodology for how to apply a map of meaning to the ledger, there's an infinite number of different ways one could go about doing it. Casey's ordinals approach is really the simplest way to do it, and I think that's why it has so rapidly gained mindshare, is that it's a compelling way to do it. It's not like he's adding unnecessary complexity to it or anything like that, which some have accused past schemes like this of being too complex. And so ordinals is just kind of making it as simple as possible. And so that perhaps makes it the most competitive to gain mindshare. So that's ordinals. the inscriptions aspect of it is then saying, okay, well, we are able to put data into the blockchain and we can assign that data to specific ordinals, again, on this layer on top of Bitcoin. Now, the data is still on layer one, just like the Satoshis are on layer one, but the mapping of the Satoshis to the data, that is the ordinals to the inscriptions, is done on an adjacent layer. I'm not even going to call it a layer on top of Bitcoin because I think one of the traps we get into is equating it with Lightning.